it has started, right?
Yes,
Should I begin?
yes,
It's live
yes,
on
please,
YouTube.
please begin.
Greetings to everyone. On behalf of the team Calcutta Comaparatists
You are live,
1919,
so I'm resuming the recording, okay?
I take this privilege to warmly welcome you to the 61st lecture of the lecture series. Calcutta Comaparatists 1919 is an independent forum for research scholars of humanities and social sciences. It carries the legacy of academic study of Indian languages and literature, envisioned by Sir Ashutosh Mukherjee and introduced in 1919 at the University of Calcutta. It is a platform for sharing research interests and ideas. We are organizing online lectures on various interdisciplinary topics to be delivered by academicians and distinguished research scholars of different fields. Thank you for joining us today. I feel immense pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Today we have with us Professor Bill Ashcroft. He does not need any introduction but the formality of this forum. Professor Bill Ashcroft is an Emeritus Professor in the School of English, Media and Performing Arts, UNSW, Sydney, Australia. He is a founding exponent of postcolonial theory, co-author of the Empire Writes Back, the first text to examine systematically the field of postcolonial studies. He is author and co-author of 21 books, variously translated into 5 languages, including Postcolonial Transformation, Postcolonial Future, Caliban's Voice, Intimate Horizons, and Utopianism in Postcolonial Literature. He is the author of over 200 chapters and papers, and he is on the editorial boards of 10 international journals. He has numerous awards and achievements to his studies, such as he has been the Fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities. He received Global Award of Academic Excellence, Australian Research Council, Australian Professional Fellowship, etc. It is my honor to welcome Professor Ashcroft to our forum. Today, Professor will be speaking on the topic postcolonialism today. Professor, now this virtual stage is yours. You may begin your lecture, sir.
Thank you very much, Jemima. It's a great pleasure to be here with this very impressive group. And after some difficulties, it's my pleasure to be back to talk to you about postcolonialism today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask the host to enable screen sharing. The screen sharing is disabled, so if I could have that enabled.
Yes, yes, sir. We have enabled the screen sharing.
Okay. Okay, so postcolonialism today, I'm going to, okay, so everything's going well so far. We've got the talk. So let me start by asking, what is postcolonial theory? Well, it's that branch of contemporary theory that investigates and develops propositions about the cultural and political impact of European conquest upon colonized societies and the nature of those societies' responses. Well, it sounds like a mouthful, but basically it's about the political impact of European conquest, and you've got Edward Said's Orientalism to talk about that. And more important to me, the nature of those societies' responses. And that's what we talk about in The Empire Writes Back. So it's also, it's important to realize that the term refers to post-invasion, not post-independence. There's a lot of confusion, a lot of discussion and argument about the term post-colonial. What is it post of? And of course, it can't be post-independence because colonialism hasn't disappeared. It's still around. It's neither a chronology nor a specific ontology. There's no one way of being post-colonial. So post-colonial is, above all, a way of reading. Now, it's a reading practice that draws attention to the profound and continuing effects of colonization upon literary production, upon anthropological accounts, historical records, and scientific and administrative writing. So its range is quite wide, but what interests me is that above all, it is a reading of postcolonial literatures. Now, who are postcolonial critics? Well, the interesting thing is that postcolonial criticism is a very, very wide church. It involves all kinds of approaches, and it's what I would call a convivial critical democracy. Convivial from the Latin meaning living together. And so although we have a lot of different approaches, the fact is that all these approaches go to make up postcolonial theory. Now, somebody has not muted their computer, so if you could all do
Yes,
that.
sir. Sorry, sir. Participants are requested to mute themselves, please, so that we can conduct the lecture smoothly. Please, participants, mute yourselves so that we can conduct the lecture smoothly.
So there we
Thank
are.
you,
That's what, sorry, that's what postcolonial theory is, and the very complicated and wide-ranging field of postcolonial critics themselves. So there's an interesting link between postcolonialism and globalization. The language of postcolonialism drove the cultural turn in globalization in the 1990s. Now, globalization studies and postcolonial studies both originated around the same time, the beginning of the 90s or late 80s. Simon Gikandi says they have at least two important things in common. First, they're concerned with explaining forms of social and cultural organization whose ambition is to transcend the boundaries of the nation state. And I'll say a little bit more about that later. But secondly, they seek to provide new ways to understand cultural flows that can be no longer explained by a homogeneous Eurocentric narrative of development and social change. Now, there's many ways in which this occurs, and I'm interested in thinking about postcolonial futures. When I talk about postcolonialism today, I think back to the year 2000 when I produced a book on postcolonial futures. And it seems that for a couple of decades now, people are saying, you know, what was postcolonialism? And I respond by saying that it has a very wide range of interests. It's a plethora of ideas about the future of postcolonial studies arose at the beginning of the century, and I was part of that myself. But there are growing themes: transnational literatures, transculturalism, multiple modernities, world literature, cosmopolitanism, postcolonial sacred, and postcolonial eco-criticism. Now, I could say a lot about each one of those, but I'll pass over that because each one of these topics could require a talk of its own. But just a couple of things. You know, we have this relationship with world literature, and the question the postcolonial critics ask is, well, which world are we talking about? Are we talking about the world of world literature, which still has Europe as the center? Or are we talking about the complex interrelationship of post-colonial societies? So there's a continuing relevance of post-colonial analysis. And, you know, really, when people were saying, well, isn't post-colonialism over? They forget that the strategies of post-colonial analysis are still relevant, even more relevant to the world today. Because postcolonial reading addresses itself to the empires of cultural, technological, and economic power and their colonizing effects. As I said before, colonialism hasn't ended. It has just changed its face in many respects. Now, how am I developing postcolonial studies? That's something I want to talk about today. I want to talk about postcolonial utopianism, that is the hope for a different future that drives postcolonial cultural production. I want to talk about borders and bordering because, as we all know, borders have become particularly toxic and a particularly prevalent topic today as asylum seekers and refugees flee their countries to try to gain lives of relative safety. But then I want to introduce a concept that sounds like the transnational, but in fact is somewhat different, and that is the concept of the transnation. So postcolonial utopianism. Now, of course, a lot of people think of utopianism, and utopia is a vain, wishful dream, something that's a fantasy. But I want to suggest that it has a very strong relevance to postcolonial studies. Now, the Utopian Studies Society began in 1988. The Empire writes back in 1989. So they have a kind of coeval origin, and both have developed their own approaches to criticism since then. But fascinating and funnily enough, there's been very little utopianism addressed by postcolonial critics, and I want to change that situation. Utopianism is really driven by Ernst Bloch's magisterial, the principle of hope. At least for me, this is the kind of the central magnum opus of utopianism in the 20th century. And it's rounded out by Frederick Jameson's Archaeologies of the Future in 2005. Bloch wrote his magisterial work over a number of years, nearly 10 years, during the Second World War, and it is an amazing tome. But many other people, such as Ricoeur and several other philosophers, have entered into the utopian arena. It's an extremely interesting one. Now, I said before that a lot of people see utopia as a sort of vain, wishful dream. And there is a difference between utopia and utopianism. There's a difference between that placeless place that was conceived by Thomas More and the spirit of hope, a difference between the representation of utopia and the anticipatory function of utopianism. And as soon as I mention that term anticipatory function, you know already that there's a relevance to post-colonial writing and creative production, because it's always looking beyond. It's looking beyond the past of colonization and the present of colonization. So Lyman-Tower Sargent calls utopianism social dreaming, which is, I think, a good way of looking at it. It's not dreaming of a perfect place, but dreaming of a transformed future. And Ruth Levitas says, it's the desire for a better way of living expressed in the description of a different kind of society that makes possible that alternative way of life. Now you see, every phrase in that statement is relevant to post-colonial writing, because both post-colonial criticism and post-colonial creative production are geared to the description of a different kind of society. It, in some respects, not openly, but much more subtly, but its whole orientation is towards a different world. And the irony of this is quite quite profound, because when Thomas More wrote Utopia, he talks about King Utopus invading the land of the Abraxas, changes its name, civilizes the indigenous inhabitants, and cultivates the natural wasteland. Now here is this is a playlist for colonization itself. Invasion, change the name, civilizing the people, cultivating the natural wasteland. And so it's extremely ironic that utopianism should be of great relevance to post-colonial cultural production. But it is. And one of the reasons is that literature has an anticipatory function. Now, literature doesn't always talk about the future, and literature is not always utopian. But Ernst Bloch puts it this way. Well, the importance of art and literature in imagining a different world. But before I talk about Ernst Bloch, let me give this very, very interesting quote from Ben Okri. He said, "Writers are the dream mechanism of the human race." The dream mechanism of the human race. And that captures perfectly something of the utopianism that is there in the dreaming of post-colonial writers. Now, Bloch uses this term Vorschein, foreseeing or anticipatory illumination, the revelation of the possibilities for rearranging social and political relations to produce what he calls highmap. Now, highmap is the home we've all sensed but never experienced or known. It's highmap as utopia that determines the truth content of a work of art. Now, Bloch, the Jewish Marxist philosopher, is very, very conscious of what he's doing when he chooses the term highmap. Highmap is a term of great relevance to Nazi Germany, the idea of the motherland, the idea of okay. So the home.
Sorry, sir, I just muted him. Sorry.
Okay, it's a little bit of noise going on in the background, so let's get back to it now. So the idea of highmap, the home that we've all sensed but never experienced or known, is very cunningly deployed by Ernst Bloch. And for Bloch, highmap always lies beyond the border, always lies beyond the border of the nation, always lies beyond the border of what we know. And so that introduces us to the concept of borders and bordering. And to start to think about this, I want you to think about what would the world look like without borders. It's almost impossible to imagine. The idea of a world without borders, where populations and peoples of varying ethnicities, cultures, and religions intermixed and interspersed. And why is it so hard to think about a world without borders? Well, you know, let's look at the growth of borders. At the end of World War II, there were 7 border walls. And when Berlin Wall fell, there were 15 border walls. But today, there are 77 border walls or fences. And indeed, when we think of borders, we do think of walls and fences, of lines on a map, But what is a border? Let's think about that. What is a border? A border is not a thing. It's not a fence or a wall. It is a practice. It's not a thing, but a practice. And that helps us reconceive the impact of borders through the act of bordering, which occurs between and within all societies. It's both a consequence and a production of power relationships. And that's why it's so hard to think about a world without borders, because those power relationships require borders. Those power relationships require the identification of an other. And that's why the bordering practices of nation states in particular have such a profound effect on the world today. But here's a border that introduces the relevance of utopianism. This is the wall, the dividing Israel and the West Bank, which is hardly a division anymore since Israel's taken over so much of the West Bank. But this wall has on it a painting which sees beyond it into the future of a tropical island. And the act of painting on this wall shows us very clearly, a very clear image of the working of utopianism, the working of a vision of a different kind of future, a different kind of world. So let's look at a poem by Cavafy, Waiting for the Barbarians, which inspired Coetzee's novel. It says, why this sudden restlessness and confusion? How serious people's faces have become. Why are the streets and squares emptying so rapidly? Everyone going home so lost in thought. Because night has fallen and the barbarians have not come. And some who've just returned from the border say, there are no barbarians any longer. Now, what will become of us without barbarians? They were those people, a kind of solution. Now, it's a brilliant poem because what it captures is our need for identifying others, the barbarians, because identifying them helps us to understand who we are. And that is at the foundation of the idea of borders, because borders by establishing who is outside, who is other, they establish who we are. That's why we can't conceive of a world without borders, just as we can't conceive of a world without power relationships. So those people, those barbarians, whether they exist or not, are a kind of solution. Now, I've been showing images of the West Bank wall, and of course, that's a classic demonstration of the way this operates, that the wall keeps out the barbarians and helps us to understand who we are. But, you know, borders of all kinds operate in a similar way. And there are borders not just around nation states or borders around societies, but there are borders that extend within. These are, in some respects, the most subtle and most interesting. Now, Mitchell says the boundary of the state never marks a real exterior. It's a line drawn internally within the network of institutional mechanisms through which a certain social and political order is maintained. In other words, bordering practices occur within the state within the physical borders of the state. And that's why the boundary of the state never marks a real exterior, because there are other ways in which bordering practices can work in a society. And these include rules, laws, restrictions, surveillance, and more subtle forms of pressure, such as nationalistic rhetoric. These bordering practices help establish who is other, and in that way, help us to confirm who we are. And that we, of course, is assumed by the nation state to include all within those borders. But as you might well know, that's not exactly the case. But an example of a bordering practice is the welfare card in Australia. Now, the welfare card is a card that is given to those people getting social security. And it is, the bordering practices work this way, that this card can only buy certain things and only from certain shops. But the interesting thing is that so far the welfare card has only been run out in Indigenous communities. So the welfare card is a classic demonstration of a bordering practice within a society, a bordering practice that determines who is other. And even though the people running this new legislation say, no, it really is to protect people, we can see that this kind of thing is the way in which bordering practices work within a society. And they're of particular interest to postcolonial theorists because the bordering practices within settler colonies are very mainly, in fact, almost exclusively designed to keep Indigenous people separated. So the Simonson says there are 8 borders or boundary markers that we can see as criteria for national membership. So what does it take for you to be a member of your nation? Well, he says national ancestry, being of the national religion, birth on the country's soil, having lived in the country for most of one's life, language skills, respect for the country's laws and institutions, having host national citizenship, and feeling as part of the nation. Now, those 8 borders are a pretty tall order. You know, you can think of yourself of who, for instance, is not part of the national religion, who has not been born on the country's soil, who has not lived in the country for most of their life. And so you see the way in which national membership operates is extremely subtle. And what Simonson is saying, and these are not formal or legislated markers of membership, they are accepted and subtle ways in which the idea of being a member of a nation operates. So the boundaries of the state, the border, the wall, the fence around the edge is only the beginning of the bordering practices of the state, because we see those bordering practices operate constantly, universally, unceasingly upon the people within the borders of the state. So let's think about borders and the horizons of literature. Now, you remember that Ernst Bloch says art and literature are fundamentally utopian because of their anticipatory illumination, their idea, their sense of a different world that's possible. Now, it doesn't mean that literature is officially utopian. What it means is that literature by its very nature is geared to imaging a different world, and the possibility of imaging a different world is the basis of the utopianism of literature. So what about borders and the horizons of literature? Well, in Step Across This Line, Salman Rushdie says, good writing assumes a frontierless nation. Writers who serve frontiers have become border guards. In our deepest natures, we are frontier crossing beings. We know this by the stories we tell ourselves, for we're storytelling animals too. So what he's saying is that we're frontier crossing beings by the stories we tell ourselves. Our stories constantly cross frontiers. Frontiers of the imagination, frontiers of history, frontiers of culture. And that is the one of the tremendous values of literature, that it does assume a frontierless nation, a nation which people can interact. Now, Edward Said, in his essay, The Mind of Winter, he suggested that exile is both the mind of winter, that is, the coldness of being separated from home,
The mind of winter.
and the invigorating condition of the public intellectuals' engagement with regimes of identity control, such as nation, religion, culture, and ethnicity. Now, that may seem like a mouthful too, but what Said, who regarded himself as an exile, and he looked to people such as Adorno, Benjamin, people who, because of their exiled nature, because of their crossing the frontiers of the state, were able to engage with regimes of identity control, were able to speak truth to power. So it's an interesting thing, the idea of being contained in the border and being able to cross that border, and the border not just a physical line, but a bordering practice. So the idea of public intellectuals who are able to speak truth to power is very much attached to the concept of a frontierless nation. Now, the creative spirit, for which literature is a powerful metonym, is the ultimate border crosser. It is inherently post-national because its tendency is not to belong. The nationality of literatures being a function of reading rather than writing. Now, I want you to think about this, because to many people this is very arguable, very controversial. But you know, a writer doesn't get up in the morning and say, I think I'm going to write a nationalist text, unless he's a propagandist. But a creative writer doesn't get up with any particular, and the creative writer doesn't get up and say, I think I'll write a post-colonial novel either. The creative writer gets up in the morning and says, I'm going to write. Now, post-colonial or post-colonialism, as I suggested, is a way of reading. And so it's a way of reading that engagement of the writer with regimes of power. But it's also read by institutions of the nation as national. And that's why the nationality of literatures is such a powerful thing. I mean, it's very, very difficult to separate literature from the nation. So, you know, we have Australian literature, US literature, British literature, Indian literature, and the you know, the grip of the nation is extremely strong. But the tendency, the urge, the vision of literature is to step across this line, is to step across the boundaries that the state sets up. Now, I'll go back to that statement of Ockery again. Writers are the dream mechanism of the human race. And those dreams always cross borders. Those dreams always exist beyond the borders that we understand. That is the whole message of highmap from Ernst Bloch. That home we've sensed but not experienced or known is the home that exists beyond the border. And it's the writers who take us to that place. And Rushdie, again, the crossing of borders of language, geography, and culture, the examination of the permeable frontier between the world of things and deeds and the world of the imagination, the lowering of the intolerable frontiers created by the world's many different kinds of thought police. These matters have been at the heart of the literary project. Just think about all that. We could go over it again, you know, the crossing of borders of language, geography, and culture. There are many kinds of borders, and they are all demonstrated in bordering practices of various kinds. The examination of that permeable frontier between the world of things and the world of imagination. And that's where literature takes us, beyond that boundary into the world of the imagination. And the lowering of the boundaries created by many different kinds of thought police. Literature has an extremely powerful function, and its function is there very much in the crossing of borders. So, highmap is not the nation. The home that we've sensed but never known is not our country, but the horizon of possibility. So the next concept I want to think about in terms of post-colonialism today is a term that I've coined called the transnation. Now, the transnation has an interesting history because post-colonialism has had a very troubled relationship with the idea of the nation. And this is interesting because, you know, the concept of national independence was something that drove much decolonizing activism. But the post-colonial dissatisfaction with the concept of nation arose from the disappointment of the nation, the disappointment of the nation's promise. You see, for those people who were talking about national independence, they had a utopian idea, but that utopia was not the nation. It was the drive towards the future. And that drive towards the future continues in post-colonial writers today. So Soyinka talked about this. It said Africa is carved up like some demented tailor who paid no attention to the fabric, color, or pattern of the quilt he was patching together. You know, the national borders, national boundaries cut between language groups. And the problem Soyinka saw was that the modern African state simply inhabited colonial boundaries. And that is the problem of the nation for him, that the nation was unable to relinquish that the connection. Now, Hobson, in his term imperialism, said that empire-bred nationalism undermined the chance of true internationalism. Now, what is empire-bred nationalism? Well, it has two varieties. He's talking on one hand about the nationalism that resisted the empire and closed itself off into a particular form of resistance and independence. But the other form of nationalism was that form of nationalism taken up by the settler colonies. So there's different kinds of nationalism bred by empire, but they all, they all hinder the chance of true internationalism. Now, Partha Chatterjee said that nationalism undermines the progress of decolonization because the national form is hostile to the cultures of the formerly colonized. He was thinking particularly of South Asia in this, but it's probably true for all formerly colonized societies. Now, what he was saying is that it reverses the problematic of Orientalism, the problematic of Orientalism being the, the passive Oriental who needs to be modernized, but still operates within the Orientalist thematic, the post-Enlightenment structure of science, knowledge, and reason. So while it's reversing the problematic of Orientalism, it's taking on the tools of Orientalism. It's taking on the thematic, the structure of science, knowledge, and reason, which it inherits from Europe. Now, Utopianism, which we see in many writers, is generated by a critique of the nation state. And we see this particularly in Tagore and Gandhi, whose utopianism, whose idea of a different India was one that tried to dispense with the problems of nationalism. Both Tagore and Gandhi were great critiques of nationalism, and they foresaw a nation very different from the one that emerged, the one that, and ironically, of course, Gandhi's idea of India is one of the most anarchistic views that we have in modern politics, but it was the thing that drove the emergence of the modern Indian nation that led by Nehru. So it's interesting that this complex interrelation of nationalism, of nation, of desire for a different form of highmap is true in all post-colonial societies. So what is the transnation? Well, transnation is the fluid migrating outside of the state. It begins within the nation. When I say outside the state, I mean beyond the state. It's a way of talking about subjects who circulate around the bordering practices of the state. Now, when I mentioned before Simonson's 8 categories of national membership, we saw then how often there'll be people in the nation who don't tick every one of those boxes. And what I want to suggest is that we're not all passive adherents to the power of the state, but the transnation is a fluid migrating outside of the state that begins in the nation. And a good philosophical or theoretical basis for this is Deleuze and Guattari's distinction between smooth and striated space. Now, smooth space is like felt, which is rolled, has no warp and woof. It's not like a normal piece of cloth. So smooth space is very different from striated space. Smooth space is the space of the transnation, the space of the nation that circulates around the structures, the bordering practices, the striations of the state. And so what we see in smooth space is a utopian vision of the possibility of a way of living across and beyond the borders of the state, the striations of the state. So Now, Scott has this concept of infrapolitics. And I don't want to suggest that the transnation is always insurgent, but his idea of infrapolitics shows how it might work. The undramatic, everyday and mundane acts of quiet evasion, slowdowns, false compliance, feigned ignorance and sabotage carried out by factory workers that when performed by many change or alter a landscape of power. Now, it's important to realise that the state is very aware of the potential of infrapolitics, of the potential of the operation of the transnation. And its bordering practices extend into reducing the ability of workers to join in collective bargaining. That is very true in Australia. It's been going on for at least 3 decades. There's been a concerted effort to undermine and in fact, obliterate ordinary workers' potential to move around the structures of the state. So it's not all that quiet when we look at it. But the transnation is the potential capacity of ordinary subjects to move around the bordering practices of the state. Now, I want to suggest that the creative spirit is the ultimate border crosser. The creative spirit is very much a function of the transnation. Now, history is a function of the nation, official history, but memory is a function of the transnation. And that makes a very big difference in the way in which we understand the operation of the nation state. And I want to suggest that the operation of the transnation that circulates around the bordering practices of the state derives a very strong theoretical basis from postcolonial studies, from postcolonial criticism. Because what we can see within the nation is a replication of the engagement of ordinary subjects with imperial power. Okay, so I want to say thank you for listening, and I'm prepared to take questions if you.
Thank you so much, sir. Is Aratrika here?
Okay, I'll just turn that. Okay, there we are.
Yes. Thank you so much, sir, for this wonderful lecture.
Yes.
Yes, Aratrika,
I
we have
can
some
unmute
questions.
myself. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, thank you, Professor, for this amazing lecture.
You're welcome.
And Professor, if you allow, we can take some questions from our participants.
Yeah, let's have 10 minutes of questions. That'll be fine.
Yes, sure.
Do we have any?
Yes, Professor, we have.
I can't see the.
It's on the chat, Professor. So like Khum Sharma is asking that the differences between post-colonial versus quote-unquote post-colonial.
Right. Say that again. Post-colonial. What was the first one? But the difference between post-colonial and
Post-colonial written together and post written in the quotes and then colonial.
Oh, okay, yes. All right. Well, look, this goes back to we used to use the hyphen, right? And we use the hyphen to actually demonstrate that post-colonialism is not some kind of grand theory of it, but people misread that and saw that the hyphen as implying that post-colonial was after colonialism. And so we changed that and write postcolonial without a hyphen now, because it is a way of reading, and that really needs to be understood. Some will say, and I probably agree with them, there is no world after colonialism, because colonialism simply changes shape. And the operation of power in the world today is one that has all the ingredients of classical imperialism and colonialism. It's the imperialism of capital and the imperialism of power, of particular kinds of cultural and racial power, but it continues today. So there is no after colonialism in that respect. It continues, and this is what I find most exciting, that the strategies of post-colonial studies or post-colonial reading are still capable of addressing the operations of power in the world today.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Shall we move on to the next question?
Yeah, I don't have any comment column here, so I can't see. Oh, there we go. Okay.
We can read the questions out.
We can read the questions for you.
I got it up. I can see. Do you want me to? Can we regard the ongoing resistance against extremism and Islamophobia in individual culture, which is trying to spread internal colonization in the name of religion, as a kind of retaliation to the conquered, and consider it to be a spirit of nationalism from humanistic part? Okay. What you see in these extreme forms of cultural and religious activism or oppression, if you put it this way, is a continuation of colonial power. Now, what I said before is that just as the independent nations occupy the boundaries of the colonial state, so we see these operations of power, you know, these you know, whether Islamic or Hindu, these extremes are setting up bordering practices. They have a need to determine who is other, to set borders and establish the other through that way. So in a sense, that is an extension of the operation of colonial power in different form. As I said before, colonialism hasn't ended, it just changed its shape. And so it's yeah, ongoing resistance to extremism, I think, is a continuation of the resistance against imperial power of a different kind. Now, Siri says is translation an imaginative concept or geographical? I don't know if you mean translation or transnation, but translation is a particularly linguistic function, and I would suggest that, in fact, transnation is an imaginative concept, because it can occur within the boundaries, the geographical boundaries of the state, or beyond them.